Today I want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about the budgeting process and also cash flow management. Now, over the last week or so, you've been talking about how you think you would set up the budget. And many of you talked about involving the stakeholders, involving people in that budget process. But I'd like to take a step back for just a second and say, well, where do you start? Well, first of all, you have to look at your mission. Look at your mission that was agreed upon when your school was founded and during your last accreditation. Use that as a starting point. The second thing, and again, this is critical, and that is your vision for the school. How do you see the school evolving during your term as the principal in the school? How do you see the school improving? When you start to lay out your budget, look at those two critical elements, the school's mission and your vision of what the school should be like. Does your budget reflect that? Too often, people just go about budgeting as if it's pretty much like just getting into your car to go to the grocery store. You get in, you turn the key, and you drive. Most people, when you go to the store, you don't think about what's on the side of the road. You don't think about a lot of things. You've been doing it 100 times or 1,000 times, and it's just becoming rote. You never really focus on perhaps the little details. But what I would suggest is that you take the time to look at those small details. Don't just simply look at your budget and say, that was fine for last year, we'll increase it by 2% or 1% or 5%. Take a hard, critical look at every element within your school. Look at the education. Were you able to accomplish the goals that you set out that were consistent with your vision and the school's mission? Did you meet those? Where did you fall down? Why did you fall down? Is it a personnel issue or is it a materials issue? Is it a training issue? What's causing your school to not be the best? When you look at aligning the money that you have with the needs that you have, make sure you understand why. Use data. Use the data that you have collected over the course of a year to build that budget. Now, one of the things that was really critical in the discussions was the relationship between the business manager and the principal. I cannot overemphasize the importance of that relationship. If there is a bad relationship between your business manager and you as the head of the school, I can almost guarantee you that there will be major problems. You need to make sure you are on the same page. How often do you sit down and talk with the person that is doing the day-to-day financial matters of the school? Build a relationship of trust so that if there's a problem, that business manager feels free to say, Dr. Murphy, I have a little bit of problem. We seem to be really going over in this area, or we're getting really close to maxing out the budget. If you don't have that type of a relationship and suddenly you're sitting back and at the end of the year when it's time to review the budget, you look back and say, well, wait a minute, how come you didn't tell me this? Why? Because most likely they didn't trust your reaction. So you need to make sure that you sit down with that person on a regular basis and talk about your vision. Talk about where things are at. Evaluate. If you wait and just review your budget every quarter, again, I can almost predict that you will have financial problems in the coming months. You need to be on top of that. You need to understand what's going on. And also, you need to verify. Too often we take accountants or financial statements as that's the actual truth. Do you ever ask to check those numbers? I know of too many cases over the years where a business manager has let things slide, whether it's with petty cash or whether it's with allowing people to get pre-payday loans, interest-free, that are never paid back, or perhaps we're not paying the vendors on time. Those are things that you need to really understand. You need to be able to go in and understand where the money is coming from, what your anticipated revenue is for a particular period of time, as well as the expenditures. When you set up a cash flow plan, what you're really doing is sitting down to say, all right, I know that in September we will be getting, let's say, 60% of our tuition money. But I also know that in June I do not have that income. Why? Because people have already paid their tuition. But you pay your teachers over a 12-month period. How will you pay their salaries? How will you pay for their benefits? How will you pay for the capital improvements that you're going to make on your facility during the summer? Make sure that you have designed a plan that basically staggers your expenditures so that, as unfortunately in too many instances, people say, well, I'm going to buy all the supplies that I need in August. Well, that's great. So I have this huge expenditure. Now, what if I don't use all that material? What happens to it? Oftentimes it just sits on a shelf and then we start the cycle all over again. So when you start looking at a cash flow projection, make sure that you really are looking at all the details. Ask the questions. Failing to ask the questions is a failure of leadership. You are the head of the institution. You need to understand every dollar that's coming into your building and going out of your building. Now, the other part, which is, again, critical, is to not only have the cash flow projections done, but also to look at your policies. If I asked you right now to go look in your files, could you come up with the financial policy handbook for your school that tells your business manager how you expect things to operate? If you're a diocesan school, oftentimes that is handed down, or at least the template is handed down from the diocesan office. But how do you make that yours? How do you incorporate that into the everyday actions? And also, again, how do teachers know the process? We've talked over the last several weeks about the organizational chart for the financial aspects of the school. If it's in a planning document, then again, you have a very clear handle on it. What should those types of things include? Well, it should include identification of accounts. That should include a cash management policy. What about taking money off property? Well, we have a football game or a basketball game. I don't really want to put it in the safe. If anything happens to that money, you as the head of the school, you're responsible. Make sure you understand that. Make sure your teachers and your support staff understand that. What about reimbursement policies? Do you give people money automatically? Are they required to submit purchase orders? Are they required to submit receipts? Can they charge it on their personal charge accounts? What about the payroll policy? Is that clearly spelled out? When pay will be given? Is it the first Tuesday of the month? Is it the second Wednesday, the first Friday? What is it? Is it on a monthly basis? Do teachers get paychecks twice a month? What would it really be? What's the budget process? And over the next coming weeks, we're going to talk about that. And that's why we're asking you to lay this out. What is the budget process? When should people start thinking about it? Actually, it should be an ongoing process for those with budget responsibility. What about tuition policies? Is it clearly spelled out when tuition is due? Some of you started talking online about the FACTS program and these programs that require tuition up front, or you can pay it monthly to a third party, and as a result, that third party gets a particular fee. How does that get handled? What reimbursement do you get from that company? How often do they reimburse you? Some will reimburse you once a month. Some will reimburse you only on a quarterly basis. Make sure that that's in your handbook and it's clearly spelled out. What about fundraising policies? And we'll talk about that, but you need to have it in the financial handbook. What about contracts? Who's authorized to sign a contract? Is there a limit on expenses? What's the relationship between the CFO and the principal? If you have a board, the CFO, the principal, and the board. What about insurance policies? We'll talk about that in the coming weeks, about retirement benefits and other forms of compensation outside of payroll. What about banking arrangements? Can people have an account outside of the school account? You'd be surprised. When I went to work with one school, I found out that they had 36 accounts that were handled by 36 different people. And all of those checking accounts used the school's tax-exempt ID. But the school did not include any of those accounts in their annual audit. Who's responsible? Well, the school's responsible, and also the individual who has signing rights on that check is also responsible. What about teacher contracts? Who keeps those? Where are they kept? Vendor lists. Who keeps those? What about current contracts? What about school credit cards? Those are just some of the things that should be included in your financial handbook. Now, the other thing that is critical as you look at your budget and your cash flow analysis is to really concentrate on evaluation. Do you evaluate programs? Do you evaluate the cleanliness of your building? Are you getting what you are paying for? Those are really critical factors that you need to include. Now, I think the other thing that I've heard you talk about, and we'll talk about in the coming weeks, are things like restricted donations. One quick statement. A restricted donation is one that a donor says, here are certain restrictions. It can only be used for X project. It must be used by X date. Now, some people don't do that. The same with endowments. Sometimes people say, I want to set up a very formal endowment. Well, what does that really mean? That doesn't mean you can use the principle of that. It's on your books, and it helps your overall financial picture. But if the endowment agreement says basically that you can only take 1% from that, that basically means that you're using the interest, perhaps, that you're getting on that. In the PowerPoints that you saw last week, some of you were asking about terms like mercantile account, the Provident Sweep account, Provident Investment accounts. I wanted to quickly clarify that. In that particular school, Mercantile was a bank. That is where the school held X number of dollars. Now, in this particular case, it was a form of endowment that was there. and it was invested over the long term. Now, the school also had what they call a Provident investment account. Provident was a bank that had a financial planning division. And what the school did was take a look at that and say, okay, we're going to take the money that we have and we know that we're going to get X number of dollars. Let's say in June, and by August, we're going to have $6 million sitting in the bank. Well, if I just have it sitting in the bank and I'm not getting any interest, well, I'm not really doing the school any great favors. So what you can do is get with your financial planners. Again, it can be at your bank or at a secondary institution, and say, okay, I want to invest these over a period of years. I'm going to need X number of dollars on a monthly basis. That's where your cash flow projections come in. So you say, okay, I'm going to do short-term bonds. Now, bonds generally aren't yielding that much right now. But you look at different vehicles and say, what can I get? Well, if I'm able to gain 1, maybe 2% if I'm lucky on that $6 million, that's something that I really didn't have to do a whole lot for. Now, the sweep account is a little bit different. The sweep account is something which was basically a money market account, which basically all the money that was in there at the end of the day was swept into an overnight investment account. Now, did it generally yield a lot of return? No. But at least we got something. And in my particular case, what I was trying to do was ensure that I could get the most for the dollars that we were given. So again, when you start looking at your financial situation and your banks, and if you're using a company like Fax, where they'll give you X number of dollars up front, or you're collecting your tuition up front, how are you managing that money over the course of an entire school year? That's your responsibility. Now, in many cases, or in some cases, in the elementary schools that are owned by the parish, you really don't have as much control of those. But what I would strongly suggest you do is talk to the financial people in the parish and the pastor and the finance committee of the parish and say, we'd like to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck, and talk about those things. Ask the questions, because you have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that you're getting the best return on the dollars that you have been given. At the end of the day, we're all struggling to get additional funds to pay for the salary increases or pay for new programs. If you manage your cash wisely and you find different forms of investment opportunities, you might have a fighting chance of getting some revenue that you never really expected. If you could get an extra $50, $60, or $100,000 a year, wouldn't you take that opportunity? And all it requires is you doing a little bit of homework and asking the hard questions. Don't simply settle. When we get into fundraising, I'm a big proponent of double checking things. I've seen too many cases where fundraising activities have gone on and people have walked off with cash. And the parish and the school are left with egg in their face. And the donors say, why in heaven's name would I ever give to your institution again? And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But when you're looking at cash management, you want to look at cash flow projections on a monthly basis for revenue and expenses. You need to make sure that you have a financial policy book that outlines all of the possible transactions and the different operations. If you want more information on that, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to share with you some materials that I put together. But again, your responsibility as the head of the school is to ensure that the cash that you have is managed correctly. It starts with your mission statement. It then moves to your vision. And then it moves into the practical implementation on a daily basis. It's about relationships, relationship with your business manager, relationship perhaps with your pastor or your board. and your relationship with your faculty. They need to trust you and make sure that they believe that you are the strong steward that you should be and that the school needs you to be in order for the school to remain viable for years to come. I hope these thoughts help. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'd be more than happy to sit down with you online or via email and share my thoughts and ideas with you. I appreciate it and have a great day.